Welcome to Kenduck's Classroom, and on this episode of Kenduck's Classroom, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Columbus and the Spanish European Conquistadors. And we have a very special treat today on Kenduck's Classroom. We have Miss Dillon to help us out.
Hello! Today we actually have even more of a treat. We are digging into our Ask a Social Studies Teacher question box. So we have a few questions about Columbus from the students. Our first question is, was Columbus sailing to prove the Earth was a sphere?
Well, that is a good question. And the answer to the question is that no, actually Columbus already knew that the Earth was a sphere. Most educated navigators at the time had already known that the Earth was indeed round. So it's actually a myth if any teacher or anyone tells you that Columbus was sailing to prove that the Earth was indeed round.
Oh, very good.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes, very interesting. All right, next question. Question number 2. Was Columbus the first to discover the Americas?
That's a great question, and it's actually a really complex question. If you think about it, Columbus was not the first person to actually come to what would be called the Americas. If you think about it, the Native Americans, did you know, were Asian hunters.
No, I did not know that.
That's right. And so actually the Native Americans' ancestors, the Asian hunters, they were in the Americas first. Now, if you were asking about Europeans, and was Columbus the first European to come to the Americas, well, actually, that's false. Columbus was not the first European to come to the Americas. There was a gentleman by the name of Leif Erikson, whose ancestors were probably from what's today Norway, and he and other Nordic Scandinavian explorers actually came to what's today Canada, and they named it Vineland. But the difference is, they just came, they did some hunting, some camping, and then they went home. And so, exactly.
So they didn't stick around.
They didn't stick around. But that's why Columbus is famous, because he and the Spanish did stick around. And that's why many people think that Columbus and the conquistadors that came after him were the first Europeans to come to the Americas. But if the question is, was Columbus the first to discover the Americas, the answer is false. We got another question?
Oh, yes, we do.
We're on fire now, aren't we?
Okay, the third question. Was Columbus a hero or a villain?
Wow, that's another really, really tough question, and it really depends on the perspective. If you're a Spaniard or you're an Italian, then Columbus is a hero, since he was the first to colonize the Americas. But from the perspective of the Native Americans, not so much. He started the process where the Europeans would come over and take Native American land and property. And so from the Native American perspective, Columbus is not really a hero. But it depends on which lens you view.
So it's up for debate.
It is up for debate. So thank you, Miss Dillon, for tuning in to Kenduck's Classroom.
Thank you for having me.
And you are welcome back anytime.
Well, thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Okay, again, thanks Miss Dillon for participating in the introduction to today's episode of Kenduck's Classroom, where we're going to discuss Christopher Columbus and the Conquistadors. Now, before we kind of continue our discussion with Columbus, what we really have to do is acknowledge and give credit to the Portuguese. Portugal was actually the first country that started doing a lot of exploring because they had a lot of very good naval technology, and there are two explorers, one with the last name Diaz and the other one with the last name de Gama, and they got this whole European exploration thing started when they were navigating the west coast of Africa, and they actually were able to make it all the way to the Indian Ocean, where there was all this wealth and gold and spices that the Europeans wanted to get. Now, of course, a logical question is, why didn't the Europeans just take a land route from Europe all the way east over the land to Asia? And the short answer, without getting too complicated, is that it would be a very long, dangerous trip where there's wars going on and there aren't cars, there aren't roads, there aren't planes, there aren't any types of transportation that are reliable back in the day. And so that's why it was a popular notion that if the Europeans sailed to the west, they could end up back east in Asia. And that's really what Christopher Columbus's goal was, to head west. The only problem was the distance was 3 or 4 times longer than he thought it was. Oh, and there was a whole chunk of land that eventually would become 2 more continents. All right, so to continue with Christopher Columbus, you really have to mention that his goal was to go and get gold. It was all about gold. I think I've said in class that gold 500 years ago, it's kind of like a credit card. Everybody takes it, everybody accepts it, and a country's wealth was based on the amount of gold that they had accrued. Another big issue was that the Europeans wanted to try to spread their Roman Catholic Christian faith. So, of course, when they come in contact with the Native Americans, after asking where the gold at, the other objective is to Christianize these uncivilized barbarians. That's the perspective from the Europeans to the natives, and that's why the natives have to be Christianized. Now, Christopher Columbus actually spent several years in Spain, and he wasn't born in Spain. He was actually born in an Italian city-state called Genoa. There was no Italy, actually, just a bunch of city-states. And Columbus had gone to Spain to try to convince the King and Queen of Spain, King Ferdinand and his wife Queen Isabella, that they should fund a journey to get to Asia heading west. And so that's really what his goal was. He spent something like 6 or 7 years trying to just persuade the king and queen, and finally they granted him his ships. And in October of 1492, Columbus lands in what we would later on call the Americas. Now, it's important to realize that throughout Christopher Columbus's life, he actually believed to the day he died as a debtor in jail that he had made his way to Asia. He refused to believe that he had found these new continents from the European perspective. And of course, it is important to acknowledge that Christopher Columbus did not treat these Native Americans very well. And there's a book that it's probably a little bit above the 6th grade reading level, but there's an author by the name of Harold Zinn, and he wrote a book called the People's History of the United States. And in the first chapter of this book, he kind of takes the side that the Conquistadors were not heroes, that they were villains, and Christopher Columbus and his men were greedy, and they chopped the limbs off of people who didn't bring back enough gold to the Europeans. So you can get into that if you'd like. There's actually some interesting stories actually that say that, you know, Christopher Columbus wasn't actually the first one to see land and that someone else had seen it, but Columbus had said, no, he saw it the night before they found land. Though, you know, you do kind of have to give some credit to Christopher Columbus, as his men were about to overthrow him because he had mismeasured the distance that he thought it would be from Europe to Asia. And he did, I guess, use good leadership skills in order to keep his men together. Then again, he was the only one that could probably navigate them back to Europe, so the men really couldn't overthrow him. So, and of course, Columbus did have a total of 4 voyages throughout the course of his career, if you will. All right, now one thing that you do have to give credit for, though he didn't treat the natives very well, was that he really did start the beginning of a new culture by having Europeans have permanent settlements in the Americas. And there's something called the Columbian Exchange, and this is basically all the goods and natural resources that went from the Americas to Europe and Africa, and from Africa and Europe to the Americas. So things like dogs and horses and pigs, these things had never actually been in the Americas until the Europeans came to the Americas. And the same thing with tomatoes and potatoes. Those had never been in Europe before. Those things actually came from the Americas. So you could take a look at this picture of the Columbian Exchange and see some of the goods that actually went back and forth between the 3 different continents, all because Columbus and the Europeans that came after him decided to go on these adventures to the so-called New World. All right, now, it is important to recognize that Christopher Columbus, although he's probably the most famous of the conquerors or the conquistadors, there are other Spanish conquerors or conquistadors that came after him. And another one of the conquistadors that's important to know about is a guy by the name of Hernando Cortez. And he's Spanish, and he's conquering for the Spanish. And what Cortez is famous for is pretty much taking over a very key civilization known as the Aztecs. The Aztecs were Native Americans who lived in what's today the country of Mexico. And their civilization was extremely advanced. And it's actually a kind of interesting story. Cortez was actually able to defeat the Aztecs because some of the other groups that the Aztecs had taken over, other groups of Native Americans, were actually fed up with the way that the Aztecs treated them. The Aztecs were harsh, cruel rulers who taxed the people that they took over. And so these people who were belligerent and upset at the Aztecs actually teamed up, even though they were Native Americans, with Cortez and his men, and that's how the Aztecs were defeated. The Aztecs had a leader named Montezuma, and apparently, allegedly, there's a story, whether or not it's myth or fact, it's hard to say, but apparently what had happened was Montezuma tried to get Cortez to leave the area by giving him a whole bunch of gold, but it didn't quite work out for the Aztecs, unfortunately. And actually, what's today Mexico City, back then was a city called Tenochtitlan, and they had all kinds of technology and irrigation and that type of stuff. But Hernando Cortez is known for taking down the Aztec Empire, and he's kind of, Cortez, the dude who came after Columbus. Now, another conquistador that you should know about is a guy by the name of Francisco Pizarro. Again, he's navigating and he's conquering for the Spanish, and he's known for taking down an advanced empire in South America called the Incan Empire. And it's kind of a very, very similar story. The leader of the Incas, a guy named Atahualpa, kind of tries to offer lots of gold and riches to Francisco Pizarro, but instead of leaving, Pizarro says, wait a minute, I can get more gold, I can enslave these people, we can Christianize them, so it'll be a pretty sweet deal for us Spaniards, for us Europeans. And unfortunately the Incans are brought down by Francisco Pizarro. Now, kind of another piece of important information to realize is that after several decades, there were actually Spaniards who thought that the way that the Spanish were treating the Native Americans was not fair and it was not right. The most famous kind of voice of reason is a guy by the name of Las Casas, Bartolomeo de las Casas. And he's actually a Roman Catholic priest who went to the Americas to convert the Native Americans, and he saw how horrible the treatment was of the Native Americans at the hands of the Spanish. And it wasn't just the violence in the battle. In fact, most Native Americans actually died when they came in contact with the Spaniards because of the diseases that the Europeans brought over. Some people think it's warfare, but it's actually the disease. And Las Casas saw the Native Americans suffer from disease and from slavery. After all, that's really what the Native Americans became, were slaves to the Spanish. And Las Casas actually debates and argues noblemen in Spain and says, look, we should treat the Native Americans more humanely. Now, of course, we can't let them have their barbaric faith. We have to Christianize them, but the way to do it is not to kill them and enslave them, but to teach them the faith, because they are smart and they are intelligent and they do have cities and technology and math and science and all those other things that civilizations have. So that is Las Casas, and you should be aware of Las Casas. And I mean, there's other explorers along the way. There's a gentleman by the name of Amerigo Vespucci, who is an Italian, and he goes to the Americas, and he actually lives with the Native Americans for quite a while, and he keeps a diary, and even today his diaries are very famous because in his diary he says lots of specific things about Native American culture that Europeans didn't know about. And of course, Amerigo Vespucci is actually what the Americas is named after. There was a German map maker who kind of used Vespucci's pictures to actually make a map. And so the German map maker said, we're going to call this land over here, this new land, the Americas, named after Amerigo Vespucci. Another dude that you may want to be aware of is a guy by the name of Ferdinand Magellan. And he was known for circumnavigating the globe. He had left Europe, he left Spain, and he went across the Atlantic Ocean under South America, went past what would be called the Strait of Magellan, and then he went off to Asia and Africa, and unfortunately for Magellan, he actually ends up being killed in a conflict with the natives on what's today the country of the Philippines. But even without Magellan, his crew continue on, and they actually make it back to Spain, and they were the first to circumnavigate or go around the globe. So that's some of the key conquistadors and explorers that you should be aware of for this chapter. I hope that you have a better understanding of some of the definitions and terminology that we'll be using in class. Again, welcome to ask me any questions if there's anything that you don't understand in class, or you can post a question here. And thanks again for tuning in to Kenduck's Classroom, where my motto is don't get fooled again on your next history test. Please feel free to join my channel here on YouTube. Thanks a lot and have a good day.